Some offerings are never meant to be unwrapped. Some secrets are never meant to be preserved. And some truths, once buried deep, refuse to remain silent, forcing their way back to the surface with slow, relentless pressure that bends history itself out of shape. December of 1873. The air lay thick and damp over the Mississippi River Delta, a suffocating veil of mist tangled through ancient cypress groves and snaking bayous. In the prosperous plantation districts, where the wounds of war were still raw beneath the surface, but the illusion of old grandeur stubbornly endured, a transaction quietly occurred. It was a kind of exchange spoken of only in murmurs, a dark reverberation of a past many insisted was gone, yet which still clung to the soil like hanging Spanish moss. Two girls, twin sisters scarcely 14 years old, their names, origins, and personal histories carefully erased, were purchased at a private auction. They were not intended for field labor, nor for service within the great house. No, what awaited them was far more sinister, swaddled in red velvet and presented as Christmas morning gifts to the Baron's two debauched sons. What followed was not a story of ghosts or divine intervention, nor of open rebellion or violent uprising. It was a tale constructed from quiet watching, desperate resolve, and almost impossible act of resistance. What those two girls would do in the spring of 1874 would not merely destroy three prominent families, but would expose a conspiracy of silence so deeply embedded that it had become the very foundation of the community itself. It would compel an entire county to burn its own records, move its courthouse, and collectively agree to behave as if an entire winter had never occurred. The Baron who purchased them was never seen again, his legacy dissolving into rumor, contradiction, and uneasy speculation. His sons were eventually found, yes, but what had been done to them, not to their bodies, but to their very essence, was something no one could adequately explain, something that defied even the crude notions of justice common to the era. And the twins, they vanished, not into nothingness, but into a network so vast and so meticulously concealed that even today, historians refuse to speak of it on record, wary of what acknowledging its true reach might imply. Before we descend further into the chilling account of the Baron and the twin girls who permanently altered the fate of St. Helena Parish, I ask you to pause and consider the weight of forgotten histories. If you find yourself drawn to the darkest recesses of American history, to the stories deliberately excluded from textbooks, to the events authorities tried desperately to erase, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments what state you're listening from. Because although this story is rooted in the Louisiana Delta, it touches more places and more lives than you may ever expect. Now, let us return to a time when the law was less a rule than a flexible suggestion, when power was measured not only in acres of land, but in the human lives bound to it, and when two children, innocent and unaware, were wrapped like porcelain dolls, delivered toward a fate that would either shatter them completely or tempt them into something unbreakable. The parish of St. Helena, Louisiana, during the winter of 1873 existed in a state of permanent half-light, suspended uneasily between the brutal aftermath of a recently ended war and the uncertain dawn of freedom that had been grudgingly conceded rather than embraced. 8 years had passed since the cannons fell silent, since the Emancipation Proclamation had, in theory, shattered the institution of bondage. Yet Reconstruction, instead of healing the South's wounds, had only driven them deeper, warping old injustices into new and more insidious forms. The grand plantations, monuments to the vanished age of cotton barons and human property, still stood. Their once pristine white columns, now chipped and flaking, glared defiantly beneath the pale winter sun, casting long, skeletal shadows across fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The labor that sustained them had changed only in name. The fields were worked by men and women who were legally free, yes, but functionally trapped within a system built on debt, intimidation, and fear. Sharecropping had replaced the auction block, but the chains had simply become invisible, forged from contracts, predatory interest rates, and the ever-present threat of eviction instead of iron shackles. Freedom shimmered like a cruel mirage, always visible, never attainable. Greensburg, the parish seat, was a small and dusty town of barely 800 residents, yet it served as the nervous system of St. Helena. It contained the courthouse, a squat brick structure plagued by a perpetually leaking roof, the land office where every deed, lien, and mortgage was obsessively recorded, and the only bank within 30 miles, its vault a mute monument to wealth concentrated in the hands of a powerful few. Greensburg was a town built on paper. Records, deeds, contracts, mortgages, titles, and the occasional bill of sale for livestock or machinery. Everything was written. Everything was filed. And in 1873, those documents were worth more than gold. They determined who owned land, and more importantly, who effectively owned people, even if the language had shifted from slave to debtor or tenant. The written word, however distorted, ruled absolutely. At the very summit of this fragile and volatile world sat a man the locals, with equal parts reverence and resentment, referred as simply as the Baron. His true name was Lucien Doe, though no one dared speak in his presence without attaching the title. He was not noble by blood, at least not by European standards, yet he carried himself with a certainty of inherited supremacy, as if the land itself bent in submission beneath his stride. Tall, with a mane of silver hair that caught light even in dim rooms, and a voice like distant thunder rolling across the delta, Doe was less a man than a force. He owned 4,000 acres of prime riverland, rich with fertile soil, and controlled the labor of more than 200 people. On paper, they were sharecroppers. On paper, they were free. But Doe controlled their debts, their contracts, their survival, and the futures of their children within a thick, leather-bound ledger locked inside his study. A ledger more powerful than any statute. His word was law. His records were scripture. He had 2 sons, heirs to his name and dominion, though not to his calculating mind or iron resolve. The elder, Henri, was 22, and a young man already hollowed out by idleness and an inherited appetite for cruelty. He shared his father's imposing height, but possessed none of his controlled authority. Henri spent his days riding the perimeter of the estate atop a magnificent black stallion, a rifle slung casually across his back, enforcing boundaries no one dared challenge. He had cultivated a reputation for quiet viciousness, a cold, measured malice that never needed to raise its voice to inspire fear. Laborers who displeased him found their food rations inexplicably reduced. Their cabins were searched without warning. Their children were abruptly reassigned to the most distant, punishing fields. His cruelty was deliberate and patient, designed not to bruise flesh but to erode hope, breaking spirits slowly rather than bodies outright. The younger son, Julien, was 19, and if anything, even more dangerous. Where Henri was restrained and calculating, Julien was volatile, a raw nerve of unpredictable rage and indulgence. He drank far too much cheap whiskey, gambled recklessly with money his father quietly repaid, and took an unsettling pleasure in watching things break. Whether it was glass, resolve, or bone, he had been expelled from 2 academies in New Orleans. Each returned home accompanied by mounting debts his father begrudgingly settled, and a temper his father, for reasons no one could fully grasp, chose to overlook. Julien collected objects obsessively: polished firearms, wickedly sharp blades, and exotic birds kept in ornate cages. Neglected and starved, the birds eventually died. He was perpetually bored, and boredom in a young man with unchecked authority and a cruel disposition was a profoundly dangerous condition, a spark endlessly searching for kindling. Lucien Doe loved his sons not for who they were, but for what they symbolized: the continuation of his name, the endurance of his dominion. He loved them as a monarch loves his heirs, as living extensions of his own power. And in December of 1873, as the holiday season approached, he resolved to give them a gift that would bind them to him irrevocably, a gift meant to teach them the final and most brutal lesson of authority, that some people were not people at all, but objects, and objects, regardless of form, could be owned, controlled, and discarded at will. The Doe estate, known to locals simply as the Baron's Place, sat at the end of a long, winding drive lined with ancient oaks whose interlocking branches formed an arboreal tunnel leading straight into the past. The house itself was a sprawling, 3-story monument to a world Lucien refused to accept had ended, built of white-painted brick. Its facade was severe and imposing, with tall, narrow windows that stared outward blankly and broad verandas wrapping the structure entirely, offering shade in summer and merciless exposure in winter. Inside, the rooms were cavernous and echoing, furnished with heavy, dark pieces shipped from France, walls adorned with portraits of supposed ancestors, figures carefully selected from European nobility rather than true bloodlines, and permeated by a silence so dense it felt like a breath held too long, waiting to be broken. Behind the main house, more than 200 people lived in cabins that had seen no real repair since before the war. These were not the romanticized whitewashed cottages of memory, but rough-hewn shacks, their roofs patched with rusted tin, their walls packed with mud, their floors nothing more than packed earth. From the first pale glow of dawn until the final trace of daylight vanished, they labored in the fields, bodies aching, spirits worn thin. At night they gathered in hushed circles, sharing what little they had, scant food, murmured stories of endurance, and urgent warnings passed carefully from one generation to the next. They knew the Doe family. They knew Henry's calculated cruelty, Julian's explosive temper, and they knew precisely what befell those who earned their displeasure. In December of 1873, a new and unsettling tension settled over the quarters, a shared sense of foreboding that something was approaching. The Baron had been traveling. 3 times in November, Lucien Doe boarded the steamboat south to New Orleans, remaining there for 2 or 3 days each trip. He told no one where he went or what business he conducted, his movements cloaked in his habitual secrecy. But when he returned, something about him had changed. Not fatigue, but a subtle alteration in his posture, like a man who had made a decisive choice and took satisfaction in its consequences. His sons noticed, exchanging uneasy glances. The workers noticed as well, their eyes following with a quiet, collective apprehension. In a place like St. Helena Parish, where every gesture, every pause, every unexplained journey carried meaning, that kind of secrecy signaled something ominous taking shape. On December 18, 1873, Lucien Doe made his final trip to New Orleans. He returned on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the air sharp with anticipation and winter's bite. And he did not return alone. The steamboat Crescent Belle, a paddle wheeler whose ornate ironwork disguised the reality of the human and material cargo it routinely carried, docked at the Greensburg landing just after sunset on December 23rd. The cold was penetrating, the sort that crept into bone and refused to leave. A thin, ghost-like mist rose in the dark, churning river, coiling around moss-covered pilings and drifting like an apparition across the rough, splintered wooden planks of the dock. The handful of men unloading freight worked with urgent efficiency, their breath clouding the air as they hurried to finish and retreat to the meager warmth of their homes. Lucien Doe descended the gangplank alone, an imposing solitary figure. In one hand, he carried a worn leather satchel, its weight obvious. His long black wool coat, tailored with exacting precision, seemed to absorb the fading light, making him appear less like a man and more like a moving shadow against the encroaching dusk. He offered only a curt nod to the dock workers, his gaze passing over them with faint, barely concealed disdain. He did not speak. His silence functioned as a command, an impenetrable barrier. Behind him, emerging hesitantly from the dim passenger cabin, 2 smaller figures appeared, fragile silhouettes against the vast river and the deepening night. They were girls, twins, identical in every discernible way, their features mirroring one another with unsettling precision. They wore plain gray dresses, their fabric thin and ill-suited to the cold, and they stood close together, as if proximity itself were the only protection they had left. Thin and threadbare, utterly useless against the biting cold that saturated the night air. Dark, coarse shawls were pulled low over their heads and drawn tight, effectively hiding their faces and stripping them of any visible identity. They carried nothing, no satchels, no bundles, no small personal items clutched close for comfort. There was nothing to indicate where they had come from, nor anything to suggest they were headed anywhere at all. They moved in perfect, unsettling unison. They stepped off the boat together. They stopped together. They waited together, like two halves of a single, silent organism. One of the dock workers, a riverman named Tobias Holt, a grizzled veteran of the waterfront, would later tell his wife, Martha, that the girls never once lifted their heads. Their eyes stayed fixed on the wooden planks beneath their feet, their gazes deliberately averted, as though the simple act of looking up might invite yet another misfortune. And when the Baron, with a casual, dismissive flick of his wrist, motioned for them to follow, they obeyed immediately. No hesitation, no questions. They moved like shadows trailing behind a solid form. Tobias, a man who had witnessed countless arrivals and departures over decades on the river, men chasing fortune, families fleeing ruin, the quiet despair of the newly freed, and the casual brutality of those with power, felt a sudden tightening in his chest. There was something deeply disturbing about the girls' absolute stillness, their complete absence of resistance. Doe led them toward a covered wagon waiting at the far end of the dock, its canvas top stained and weather-worn from years of use. The driver, a man named Cato, a stoic and taciturn figure who had worked the Doe stables for decades, climbed down from the driver's seat. His face, carved by sun and years of labor, showed no emotion as he unlatched the rear flap. The Baron gestured once more, a silent, unquestionable command. Without a word, the twins climbed into the wagon, disappearing into the pitch-dark interior. Cato closed the canvas flap with practiced efficiency, securing it tightly. With the creak of wooden wheels and the dull, wet thud of hooves against the muddy road, the wagon rolled away, quickly swallowed by the deepening darkness and the swirling river mist. No one asked questions. No one ever did, not when it involved the Baron. To question was to invite trouble, and in St. Helena Parish, trouble often arrived swiftly and ended brutally. But Tobias Holt, who had lived 43 years and seen more than most, would later say that something else settled over him that night. A coldness unrelated to the weather, a gnawing certainty that something profoundly wrong, something unnatural, had just entered St. Helena Parish, and that it would not depart quietly. It was a premonition, a shiver that clung to his spine long after the sound of the wagon's wheels faded into the night. The wagon followed the river road, a narrow, winding track that traced the serpentine bends of the Mississippi back toward the Doe estate. The journey, nearly an hour long, was grueling. Years of neglect and relentless rains had left the road deeply rutted and uneven. The wheels groaned and complained at every jolt and turn, their mournful protests cutting through the otherwise suffocating silence. Inside the wagon, cloaked in darkness, the twins sat without movement or sound. Cato, driving with his back to them, his attention fixed on the road and the horses, would later swear that he never heard them speak. Not once. No whisper, no sigh, not even the subtle shift of bodies adjusting to discomfort. It was as though they had ceased to exist, reduced to silent cargo. When the wagon finally passed through the towering wrought iron gates of the Doe estate, it was close to 8 o'clock. The house stood illuminated against the surrounding darkness, every window glowing with warm lamplight that suggested comfort while concealing the coldness within. Henri and Julien waited on the front veranda, their figures silhouetted against the brightness behind them. They smoked cigars, the embers flaring briefly with each draw, their eyes fixed on a long drive disappearing into shadow. When the wagon emerged from the gloom, both men straightened. They flicked their cigars into the damp earth and descended the wide stone steps, their footsteps echoing faintly in the open air. Lucien Doe stepped down from the wagon, a rare, satisfied smile touching his lips, an unmistakable expression of triumph. He turned toward his sons, his gaze passing over them with proprietary pride. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice warm and resonant, laced with chilling pleasure, "your Christmas gifts have arrived." Henry's brow tightened almost imperceptibly, a brief flicker of unease passing across his otherwise impassive face. Julien, by contrast, smiled broadly, a wide, predatory grin that revealed far too much. Cato opened the rear of the wagon, and the twins emerged, moving once again with that same unnerving synchronicity. For the first time, standing beneath the harsh, unforgiving lamplight spilling from the house, the Baron's son saw them clearly. They were undeniably young, 14, perhaps 15 at most. Their bodies were still slender, not yet fully formed. Their skin held a warm, light brown tone. Their hair was dark and braided tightly against their scalps, meticulously neat. Their faces, now unobscured, were identical in every detail. High, delicate cheekbones, full, unsmiling lips, and dark, fathomless eyes that caught the lamplight like polished obsidian, revealing nothing of the thoughts or emotions behind them. They possessed a striking, almost otherworldly beauty, the kind that unsettled rather than attracted, precisely because they were still children, and beauty in children, especially those so utterly vulnerable, was a dangerous and often tragic thing. Julian, ever impulsive and openly cruel, stepped forward and began to circle them slowly, his gaze lingering, appraising them with the detached scrutiny one might reserve for a prize stallion or a newly acquired hunting dog. Henri remained where he stood, his face an unreadable mask of cool indifference. "Where did you find them, father?" Julian asked, his voice edged with possessive curiosity. "New Orleans," Lucien replied, his tone measured and calm, as though he were speaking of nothing more remarkable than furniture or fine wine. "Smug. A private transaction. Very private," he continued. "They have no papers, no relatives, no recorded past. As far as the world is concerned, they do not exist. They are ghosts, waiting to be given shape by our will." Henry's frown deepened, a faint crease forming between his brows. "Father, the law," he began, a note of caution creeping into his voice. Even Henri, for all his coldness, understood that the legal ground beneath them had shifted since the war. "The law," Lucien cut in sharply, his tone dismissive and final, "is what I say it is, Henri, and I say these girls are property. My property, and now by extension yours. A gift, a lesson, a tool." He gestured toward the twins with a broad, possessive sweep of his hand. "They will serve you. They will obey you. They will do whatever you ask, without question, without complaint. Consider them an education in power, gentlemen, because power is not merely something you inherit. It is something you take, something you assert, something you command." Julian laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped against the night air, devoid of any real humor. Henri, as was his habit, said nothing. His silence carried more weight than his brother's laughter ever could. The twins stood motionless, their eyes still fixed on the ground, their hands folded neatly before them in a posture of perfect compliance. They did not react to Lucien's words. They did not flinch. They did not even appear to breathe. They simply waited, two silent figures frozen beneath the unforgiving lamplight. Lucien Doe clapped his hands once, the sharp crack echoing through the cold air. "Take them inside," he ordered Cato, his voice brisk, efficient. "Put them in the east wing, the small room at the end of the hall. Lock the door, and see that they are fed sparingly." Cato nodded, his expression unchanged, and motioned for the twins to follow. They obeyed, moving once again with that same eerie synchronicity. Their footsteps made no sound as they crossed the veranda and vanished into the hollow stillness of the house. As they disappeared into the cavernous interior, Lucien turned back to his sons, triumph glinting in his eyes. "Merry Christmas, gentlemen," he said softly, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Use them wisely. And remember, they are a testament to our enduring will." Then he went inside, leaving Henri and Julian standing in the bitter cold, staring at the door through which the twins had vanished, the implications of their father's gift slowly sinking in. That night, no one in the quarters slept well. The workers, huddled together in unheated cabins, whispered in the darkness, sharing what little they knew, what little they had seen, that the Baron had returned from New Orleans with something locked away in the East Wing, something meant as a gift for his sons. The air was heavy with unspoken dread. with a shared understanding that the old ways, though abolished by law, were far from dead. And in the main house, in the small, cold room at the far end of the east wing, the twins sat on the bare floor in total darkness, their hands clasped together, their bodies pressed close for warmth and reassurance. They waited for Christmas morning, for whatever new horror it might bring. Their silence was not submission, but vigilance, a deep, watchful stillness, a quiet reckoning with their new prison. Christmas Day, 1873, dawned not with carols or cheer, but with suffocating grayness. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of old iron pressing down upon the delta. Shortly after sunrise, a light, persistent rain began to fall, tapping softly against the tall, narrow windows of the dough house like fingernails drumming against glass, a mournful accompaniment to the day. Inside, the Doe family gathered in the main parlor, a vast, dim room dominated by a massive fireplace that offered little warmth. Lucien Doe sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. His silver hair was combed back with precise care, his expression serene, almost beatific, as though he had just performed a great act of generosity. Henri and Julien sat on either side of him, both unusually subdued, their usual bravado muted by their father's presence and the unspoken weight of the previous night's events. The table was laid with imported china, delicate porcelain etched with intricate designs, and crystal goblets that caught what little light the room allowed. Breakfast was lavish: smoked ham, fresh biscuits, homemade preserves, and steaming coffee, served by two women from the quarters. Their faces were carefully blank, their movements swift and practiced, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. No one mentioned the twins. Their absence was a presence in itself, a silent truth hanging over the room like a shadow. After the meal, Lucien rose, a small motion of his hand signaling his sons to follow. They moved through the house in silence, their footsteps echoing across the polished floors until they reached the east wing, a colder, rarely used portion of the house, sparsely furnished and faintly musty. From his waistcoat pocket, Lucien produced a small, ornate key, its brass dull with age. With a soft click, he unlocked the heavy wooden door at the very end of the corridor. The room beyond was barely larger than a storage closet. It held a narrow bed with a thin, worn mattress, a single unsteady wooden chair, and a small washstand topped with a chipped porcelain basin. The air was stale, tinged with dust and confinement. The twins sat on the floor exactly where they had been left the night before, their bodies pressed together, their hands still clasped. They looked up as the door opened, their dark eyes meeting Lucien's for a brief moment. Their expressions did not change. They remained unreadable, smooth as stone. Lucien stepped aside with a faintly theatrical gesture and motioned his sons into the cramped space. "They are yours now," he said, simply, his voice flat and emotionless, as though he were discussing a new plow or a piece of farm machinery. "Do with them as you please. They are yours to command." Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft but final thud, leaving his sons alone with their gifts. What occurred in that small, cold room over the following 3 months was never fully documented, never captured in complete or explicit detail. The twins, later known as Cora and Clara, never spoke of it in the years that followed. Their silence became its own form of testimony, a boundary around memories too terrible to give voice to. And the Doe's sons, Henri and Julien, never offered explanations either, their recollections conveniently selective, fragmented, and self-serving. Yet fragments remained. Whispers, slivers of testimony gathered later from people in the quarters, men and women who saw things out the corners of their eyes, heard things through walls and across courtyards, and noticed patterns amid the exhausting rhythm of their own lives. When these fragments are pieced together, they form a chilling, unspoken picture. A woman named Deline, who worked in the main house as a cook, her hands perpetually dusted with flour and slick with grease, later said that the twins were brought down to the kitchen every morning for a single meager meal: a crust of stale bread, a cup of water. Sometimes, if fortune briefly favored them, a piece of bruised fruit. They ate quickly, their movements precise and economical, never wasting emotion. They did so in absolute silence, their eyes never lifting to meet hers. The moment they finished, they were taken back upstairs, their presence passing like an unsettling shadow. The line swore they never looked at anyone, never asked for anything, never made a sound. Their silence, she said, was not calm, it was unnerving. A man named Ezra, who worked the stables, his hands permanently twisted and calloused from years of handling horses and heavy tack, recalled seeing Julie and Doe lead the twins out toward the old carriage house one afternoon in late January. The air was sharp, the ground still stiff with frost. Ezra remembered Julian's laughter, high, harsh, and discordant, carrying across the yard, and the twins' complete lack of response. He said that later he heard sounds coming from the carriage house. Sharp, splintering noises, like with breaking or something being struck again and again. He did not investigate. No one did. To investigate was to invite the Baron's attention, and that was a price no one dare pay. Ezra turned his back, pretending not to hear, not to see. A young girl named Bess, barely 12 years old and assigned to laundry, her small hands perpetually raw from lye soap and cold water, recalled seeing the twins once through an upper window. It was a rare moment of stillness in her long day. She said they were standing in their small room, facing one another, their hands clasped tightly together. Their lips were moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Bess thought they might have been praying, some desperate, silent supplication, but she could not hear a word. Even from a distance, she said, their faces seemed carved with ancient sorrow far beyond their years. And then there was Samuel, the carriage driver, a solid, dependable man who had served the Doe family for decades. He recalled that in early March he was instructed to drive Henri and the twins into Greensburg. Spring was beginning to soften the air, carrying the damp scent of turned earth and the first hint of magnolia. Samuel remembered Henri sitting rigidly in the carriage, his gaze fixed straight ahead, while the twins sat beside him, perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes lowered as if carved from wood. Samuel said that Henri took them into the courthouse, the same courthouse where deeds and contracts were filed, where lives were shaped and erased by ink and signatures. They remained inside for nearly an hour. When they emerged, Henri was smiling, a thin, satisfied curl at the corner of his mouth. The twins, as always, were not. Their faces remained blank, unreadable. In a rare moment of curiosity, Samuel asked Henri what business they had conducted inside. Henri waved him off sharply, telling him to mind his own affairs, his tone carrying a clear warning. But Samuel noticed something else. As the twins climbed back into the carriage, one of them, he could never say which, their resemblance was too exact, was holding a piece of paper. It had been folded small and tucked carefully into the sleeve of her plain gray dress. Almost invisible, but Samuel saw it. Just for an instant, a flash of white against dull fabric. He never saw it again. The paper, like so many things connected to the twins, vanished into shadow. By mid-March, whispers spread to the quarters, not because of what people had seen, but because of what they had not. The twins had been at the Doe estate for 3 long months, and in all that time, no one had heard them speak. Not a single word, not a cry of pain, not a sigh, not even the smallest sound of human utterance. Their silence became a source of deep unease. Some said they were mute, born without speech. Others believed they had been broken beyond repair. And some, more inclined toward superstition, whispered that the girls were something else entirely, something unnatural, something touched by the spirits of the bayou itself. Then, on the night of March 19th, 1874, as the first fireflies flickered to life in the humid air, everything changed. The long vigil of silence was about to end. The twins, Cora and Clara, had not been idle in their confinement. Their silence was not submission, it was armor, a carefully maintained facade behind which their minds, sharp and resilient, worked with quiet, desperate intensity. Their mother, back in Virginia before the fire that destroyed their home, had been a seamstress, but she had also carried a fierce reverence for learning. Against every danger, she had taught her daughters to read and write. Such knowledge was considered dangerous for girls like them, but it would become their salvation. She had taught them how to decipher looping script and ornamental flourishes, how to unlock meaning from ink and paper. And in the dough house, a place where books served more as decoration than as tools, they discovered something invaluable. In the dusty, forgotten corners of the East Wing, inside a small and used library that smelled of mildew and neglect, they found old books, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed, waiting, volumes of law, forgotten histories, and even a handful of tattered novels. No one had bothered to secure them. Who among the servants would dare touch such things? And who among the Doe family would ever notice they were missing? Late at night, long after the house had settled into silence and the last oil lamp had been extinguished, Cora and Clara would slip quietly from their room. They moved like apparitions, their bare feet soundless against the cold wooden floorboards. By the faint, trembling glow of a stolen candle stub, or sometimes by the pale wash of moonlight filtering through a grimy window, they read. They consumed the words with a hunger born of desperation, absorbing them, understanding them. They learned about the law, about contracts, about ownership and property. And most critically, they learned about the chaotic, often contradictory legal terrain of Reconstruction. They discovered that even within a system designed to oppress, there were fissures, loopholes hidden within the structure, cracks in facade for those who knew how to look. They learned about the courthouse in Greensburg, about its ledgers, its filings, its official seals and stamps that transformed ink and paper into unquestionable truth. They came to understand that a properly executed document could wield a power greater than the baron's wealth, greater even than his son's cruelty. When Henri had taken them into town in early March, ostensibly filed the paperwork that would officially register them as property of the Doe family, a grotesque and illegal act that nonetheless went unchallenged in St. Helena Parish in 1874. Cora had recognized her moment. While Henri, arrogant and distracted, spoke with the clerk, Cora, with an almost unnatural calm, slipped away. She found the records room, a dim, dusty chamber lined with towering shelves of heavy ledgers. Her eyes, sharpened by countless stolen hours of reading, quickly identified the exact book where the document was meant to be filed. Her heart hammered in her chest like a trapped bird as she carefully removed a single blank page, a pristine sheet of official paper, its edges crisp, its surface untouched and waiting. That page, folded small and hidden within the sleeve of her plain gray dress, was a fragile seed of hope the twins now carried. It was their weapon, their shield, their only chance. They had endured the previous 3 months not out of submission, but out of deliberate, calculated patience, waiting for precise moment to act. Their silence was not weakness. It was strength, terrifying in its depth. March 19th, 1874, fell on a Thursday. It began like any other day, yet would end in a rupture that reshaped everything. The weather had turned decisively warm, the first languid breath of true spring, a welcome release from winter's long grip. The air was heavy with humidity and rich with scent. Wet earth, emerging life, and the sweet, intoxicating bloom of jasmine just beginning to open. In the corridors, the workers, exhausted but buoyed by the promise of gentler days, finished their labor in the fields. Hoes and shovels clinked softly as they returned to their cabins, grateful for the lingering daylight. At the main house, the rituals of power and privilege continued uninterrupted. Lucien Doe sat in his study, the room thick with the smell of old leather and cigar smoke, reviewing his ledgers beneath the glow of a single oil lamp, his brow creased in concentration. Henri lounged in the parlor, stretched across a velvet armchair, idly turning the pages of a week's-old newspaper, his thoughts elsewhere. Julien, restless as ever, was in the stables, the air dense with hay and horse sweat, drinking cheap whiskey from a flask while methodically cleaning his favorite rifle, its polished barrel catching the light with an ominous gleam. The twins, Cora and Clara, were in their small, cold room, just as they'd been every night for 3 months. their existence a silent, nearly forgotten fixture of the East Wing. At approximately 9 o'clock, as the final traces of twilight dissolved into a moonless, star-scattered sky, Deline the cook was making her way back toward her cabin in the quarters. Her day was finished. Her feet ached, and her thoughts were already drifting toward the brief mercy of sleep. As she passed the main house, her gaze, trained by years of vigilance, lifted instinctively toward the East Wing. She stopped abruptly, her breath caught in her throat, a cold knot formed in her stomach. The East Wing window, the window of the twins' room, was open. This was deeply wrong. Deline remembered clearly how the window had been nailed shut in January, after Julian, in a fit of irritation, complained that the twins stared out too often, their silent gazes unsettling him. Deline herself had seen the nails, long, thick iron spikes driven deep into the wooden frame with brutal finality. And yet now the window stood open, a dark rectangular void against the pale wall, its thin, grimy curtain fluttering softly in the night breeze. A signal. Deline stood frozen in the darkness, her heart beginning to pound heavily against her ribs, watching, waiting. Then she saw movement. A shadow, low, swift, impossibly quiet, passed across the open window. Then another, identical to the first. The twins were climbing out. Her first instinct was to cry out, to raise the alarm, to fulfill the unspoken obligation owed to the Baron. But something stopped her, something deep and instinctive. Perhaps it was the way the girls moved, silent, deliberate, purposeful, like creatures born to the dark. Perhaps it was a memory of the sharp, splintering sounds she had once heard from the carriage house weeks earlier, sounds she had tried and failed to forget. Perhaps it was the simple, undeniable truth that some people, regardless of their place in the world, deserved to run, deserved a chance to escape. Or perhaps it was a chilling realization that what was unfolding before her, however dangerous, was a quiet act of justice. Deline said nothing. She turned slowly and deliberately and walked back toward her cabin, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her ears straining for any sound from a house. She did not look back, not once, afraid that even a glance might shatter the fragile spell, might betray the silent pact she had just made with her. Conscience. The twins dropped from the open window onto the soft, damp earth below, landing with controlled grace that spoke of careful preparation. They rolled instinctively to absorb the impact and rose immediately, breaking into a run, their bare feet soundless against the dew-soaked grass. They did not flee toward the main road, nor toward the river, which promised only danger and uncertainty. Instead, they ran toward the quarters, a cluster of dark, sleeping cabins pressed against the far edge of the Doe property. They moved through the night like drifting smoke, slipping between buildings, their shapes barely distinguishable from the deeper shadows. They avoided the few workers still awake, those lingering in doorways to enjoy the cooler air after a warm day. The twins seemed to know precisely where they were going. Their path never wavered, as though the route had been mapped and remapped in their minds countless times, as though they had waited patiently for this exact convergence of warmth, darkness, and opportunity. They stopped before a small cabin near the outermost edge of quarters. It belonged to a woman named Iris and her 3 young children. Iris was a widow. Her husband, a quiet and diligent man, had been killed 2 years earlier in a terrible accident involving a runaway plow and a frightened horse. Since then, she worked the fields from dawn until dusk, her back bent, her hands hardened by labor. Keeping mostly to herself, her grief carried in silence. The others respected her for her endurance, for the steady strength with which she bore her loss. The twins approached the door, their hearts pounding, and knocked softly, so softly it was almost nothing at all. Iris opened the door, her face marked by exhaustion, her eyes heavy with sleep. When she saw them standing there in the pale moonlight, 2 identical figures, their expressions grave and intent, she froze, a sharp breath catching in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she thought they were spirits, or perhaps remnants of a dream. "Please," one of the twins whispered. The word was barely louder than the chirring of insects in the grass. It was the first word anyone had heard either of them speak in 3 months, a sound so fragile it seemed it might fracture the night itself. Her voice was rough and used like a rusted hinge finally forced to move. "Please, we need help." Iris stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, her thoughts racing, trying to reconcile the silent, ghost-like girl she had glimpsed around the house with these two desperate children standing at a threshold. The danger of what they were asking was obvious. The consequences were terrifying. Then, slowly, she stepped aside, her movement stiff, and let them in. She closed the door gently behind them, sealing the cabin in near total darkness. Inside, by the flickering, uncertain light of a single tallow candle, the twins, Cora and Clara, finally told their story. Their voices, though still soft, gathered strength as the words poured out, as if a dam had finally burst. They were not from Louisiana. They were from Virginia, from a small, quiet town near Richmond, surrounded by rolling hills and tobacco fields. Their mother had been a skilled seamstress, her nimble fingers capable of delicate, intricate work. Their father had been a dependable blacksmith, his forge a constant source of warmth and light. They had lived a simple but good life, shaped by routine and family, until disaster struck in the summer of 1872. A sudden, devastating fire consumed their home, killing both of their parents and leaving the twins orphaned at barely 13 years old. With no relatives to take them in, they were placed under the care of a local church. The pastor had promised to find them safety, stability, a new beginning. Instead, burdened by poverty and overwhelmed by the sheer number of war orphans, the church sold them, not officially, not legally, but sold them nonetheless, to a man who trafficked in children, orphans, runaways, anyone unlikely to be missed, anyone whose disappearance would go unchallenged. That man, a shadow who moved easily between states, took them to New Orleans, a city overflowed with both opportunity and despair. There, they were kept in a cramped, filthy house with other children, all waiting like livestock to be sold again, their futures dangling by a thread. In December of 1873, Lucien Doe arrived. He inspected the children with a cold, appraising gaze, devoid of pity, as one might examine cattle at market. He selected the twins, perhaps drawn by their identical faces, their quiet composure, and paid in cash, a thick roll of bills. And just like that, their fate was sealed. They had spent 3 months at the Doe estate, 3 months locked in a small, freezing room, 3 months of being used, controlled, and reduced to objects rather than human beings. Their humanity had been stripped away piece by piece. They endured because they had no choice, no path of escape, but they were also planning methodically, patiently, because they possessed something their captors did not know. They could read, and they could write. Their mother had taught them in Virginia, before the fire, instilling in them a love of knowledge that defied the limits imposed on their lives. And in the Doe house, in a dusty, forgotten library, they found books, old books, neglected books, volumes no one thought to guard, because who would care? At night, by stolen candlelight or moonlight, seeping through dirty glass, they read, and they learned. They learned about the law, about contracts and property, about the loopholes hidden within the chaos of Reconstruction. They learned that while the spirit of the law could be ignored, the letter of the law, if properly wielded, still carried weight. They learned about the courthouse in Greensburg, about signatures, about seals, about how ink and paper could shape reality itself. And when Henri had taken him into town in early March, claiming he was there to file the document that would legally bind them to the Doe family, Cora had acted, while Henri, arrogant, distracted, spoke with the clerk. She had slipped away, engrossed in his own sense of importance. Spoke with the clerk. Cora, her heart hammering violently in her chest, had slipped away. She found the records room, a maze of shelves and dust-laden ledgers, and in a moment of sharp clarity, she located the exact book where their fate was meant to be recorded. From it, she stole a single blank page, a pristine sheet of official paper, untouched, waiting to be transformed by ink into something powerful. It was that page, folded carefully and hidden inside Cora's sleeve, that the twins now showed Iris. It was their declaration, their last desperate appeal. "We can write our own document," Cora said, her voice steady now, carrying a quiet conviction. "We can say we were freed. We can say we have the right to leave. But we need a witness, someone who will sign it, someone who will say it's true, someone who will stand with us." Iris stared at the blank paper, then at the twins, their faces earnest and resolute in the candlelight, then back at the page. The weight of what they were asking pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. "If I sign this," she whispered slowly, her voice trembling, "and they find out, they will kill me. They will kill my children." The fear in her words was raw, unmistakable. "If you do not sign it," the other twin, Clara, said quietly, her voice unwavering, "they will kill us, and they will keep doing what they do. Nothing will change." Iris fell silent. Outside, the night was warm and still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, a lonely sound swallowed by the darkness. The candle flickered, throwing restless shadows across the cabin walls, making the twins' faces appear both fragile and unbreakable. Iris thought of her children sleeping in the next room, of how easily their lives could be torn apart. She thought of the injustices she had witnessed, the quiet suffering she carried every day, and she thought of the courage standing before her. Two girls barely past childhood, asking her to risk everything. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, Iris reached for the pen. The nib scratched faintly against a rough wooden table as her hand trembled. Fear coursed through her, but once her resolve settled, it held firm. Iris signed the document in the early hours of March 20th, just before the first faint light of dawn brushed the eastern sky. Her hand shook as she wrote her name, simple, careful lettering, the mark of her own modest education. But the signature was clear, unmistakable, a defiant line drawn against the Baron's power. The twins looked at her with fragile, shining hope and thanked her with a gratitude too deep for words. They folded the paper with meticulous care and tucked it back into Cora's sleeve, a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. "What will you do now?" Iris asked, her voice still trembling but touched now with awe. "We will leave," Clara said, her voice calm, certain. "Tonight, before they notice we are gone, before the sun fully rises and shows our absence. And if they catch you," Iris pressed, dread tightening in her chest as she imagined the Baron's retribution. The twins exchanged a look, a silent communication shaped by shared suffering. And for the first time, Iris saw something in their dark eyes that was not fear or despair, but something colder, harder, unyielding, a glint of steel. "They will not catch us," Cora said flatly. But they did not leave that night. Before they could, before the sun's first rays fully pierced the darkness, something happened that shattered their careful timing and forced their plans into a desperate, immediate gamble. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, as the first roosters began to crow, Julie and Doe, restless and irritable even at dawn, decided to go to the east wing to check on the twins. The door was locked, as it always was, a reassuring symbol of control. But when he unlocked it and pushed it open, the room was empty. The narrow bed lay untouched. The lone chair sat where it always had. And the window he himself had ordered nailed shut, stood open, its thin, grimy curtain fluttering gently in the cool morning breeze like a mocking flag of defiance. Julian's face drained of color, a cold primal fear, foreign and unwelcome, clutched at him. He ran down the stairs, his boots thundering against the polished wood, shouting for his father, for his brother, for anyone who would answer. His voice cracked with rage and disbelief. Within minutes, the Doe estate erupted into chaos. The quiet morning, usually reserved for slow preparations and rigid routines, dissolved into shouting and frantic motion. Lucy and Doe, dragged from sleep, his silver hair disordered and his face contorted with fury, ordered an immediate and exhaustive search. Every cabin in the corridors was to be entered, every corner examined, every worker questioned, their answers dissected for any hint of deception. The twins would be found and returned, no matter the cost. His authority, his carefully cultivated image of absolute control, had been challenged, and that, above all else, was unforgivable. Henri, ever dutiful in his cruelty, assembled a group of armed men and began sweeping the vast fields, his rifle ready, his expression hard. Julien, still pale with shock and simmering rage, led another group into the dense woods along the river, his movements erratic, his temper volatile. Lucien himself went straight to quarters, moving from cabin to cabin like a gathering storm, his presence terrifying, his voice booming with barely restrained wrath as he demanded answers. The workers, roused from their sleep, stood silently. Their faces were blank, their eyes carefully empty. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. Their shared ignorance formed a shield, a quiet, collective act of resistance. With every denial, every unblinking stare, Lucien's expression darkened further. But the twins were already gone, and St. Helena Parish was about to learn what happens when silence, paper, and resolve collide with unchecked power. He did not press them. Not yet. He understood the futility of brute force against a wall of unified silence. But his patience was thinning by the hour. By midday, the search expanded beyond the boundaries of the Doe estate, spreading outward like ripples across still water. Riders were sent to neighboring plantations, into the dusty streets of Greensburg, and down to the busy river docks. A detailed description of the twins was passed from mouth to mouth. Identical girls, 14 or 15 years old, light brown skin, dark hair braided close to the scalp, plain gray dresses. But no one had seen them. The delta, vast, tangled, and merciless, seemed to have swallowed them completely. By evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and long, ominous shadows stretched across the land, Lucien Doe was incandescent with rage. He gathered his sons in his study, the air inside thick and stifling, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. Workers standing outside in the yard strained to listen. They could hear his voice, a low, guttural roar, even if they could not distinguish the words. It was enough. The sound alone spoke of a man pushed to the very edge. And then, just after sunset, as the first stars pierced the darkening sky, something happened that no one, not even Lucien Doe, in his wildest imaginings, had anticipated. The twins walked out of quarters. They emerged calmly and deliberately, side by side, their hands folded neatly in front of them, their expressions composed, almost serene. They crossed the dusty yard without haste, passing the stables where horses shifted and whinnied nervously, passing the old carriage house, until they stopped directly before the main house. Their small figures stood silhouetted against the lamplit veranda. Their return was not surrender. It was a calculated, audacious challenge. Lucien Doe, who had been pacing the veranda like a caged predator, froze mid-step. He stared at them in stunned disbelief. His mouth open-closed, then open again, no sound emerging. "Where have you been?" he finally demanded, his voice thick with both rage and shock. The question was not truly about their absence, but about the audacity of their presence. Cora moved slowly, deliberately. She reached into her sleeve and withdrew the folded document. The once blank page was now filled with precise, elegant script, signed and witnessed. She held it up, extending it toward Lucien so he could see it clearly in the fading light. "We have been freed," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, stripped of fear, a stark contrast to the trembling whisper Iris had heard hours earlier. "This document says so. It is signed and witnessed. We are no longer your property, Baron Doe." Lucien descended the steps slowly, his eyes locked on the paper, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing, what he was hearing. He took the document from Cora's outstretched hand, his fingers brushing hers, and unfolded it with sharp, almost violent motion. His eyes moved across the lines, his brow knotting tighter with each word. For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing. The silence was broken only by the chirring of crickets and the distant croak of frogs rising from the bayou. Then a sound escaped him. It began as a low chuckle. Then it grew into a harsh, bitter laugh, stripped of humor, cold and unsettling. Workers watching from the shadows of the quarters shivered as a ripple of unease passed through them. "This," Lucien said, holding up the paper, his hand trembling slightly, "is a forgery, a clumsy, pathetic forgery. Do you truly think this will save you?" His voice sharpened. "Do you believe such a crude deception can stand against my word?" "It is not a forgery," Clara said. Her voice matched her sister's, calm, firm, unyielding. "It is a legal document. It was filed at the courthouse in Greensburg. It is on record. It is official." Lucien's mocking smile vanished. In its place came stunned disbelief, followed by dawning horror. "What?" he whispered, the single word sharp and disbelieving. "We filed it this morning," Cora explained, her tone precise, almost instructional. "Before you woke, before you knew we were gone. It is in the ledger now. It is official. It is a law." Lucien's face flushed from pale shock to a deep, furious red. He crumpled the paper in his fist, crushing the words of freedom, and stepped toward the twins, his eyes blazing with a dangerous intensity. "You think you are clever?" he snarled, his voice low, predatory. "You think you can outmaneuver me, Doe? You are wrong. I will go to that courthouse. I will have that document removed, burned, erased, and then I will bring you back here and ensure you never attempt this again. I will break you." "You cannot remove it," Cora said. Her voice did not waver. Her gaze met his directly, unflinching. Lucien halted mid-step, his body stiffening. "Because it is not the only copy." The air seemed to crack with sudden tension. "We made 3 copies," Clara continued, her voice soft but chilling. "One is filed in the courthouse. One is with a witness who will testify for us, a person of good standing in this community. And one is hidden where you will never find it, a safeguard. If anything happens to us," she went on, "if we disappear, if we are harmed, all 3 copies will be made public. Everyone will know what you did. Everyone will know you bought us. Everyone will know you kept us as slaves 9 years after slavery was abolished. Your name, Baron Doe, will be synonymous with shame." Lucien stared at them, his jaw tightening, a muscle in his cheek twitching violently, his fists clenched, trembling with restrained fury. The audacity, the sheer unimaginable defiance of these 2 girls struck him like a physical blow, to his very core. "Who is the witness?" he demanded, his voice reduced to a thin whisper laced with something desperate and lethal. The twins said nothing. Their silence, once a shield, had now become a weapon. "Who is the witness?" Lucien roared, his voice tearing across the yard and shattering the fragile calm of the evening. And then, from the darkness at the edge of the quarters, a voice answered. It was a woman's voice. It trembled, but it did not break. Clear, steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am." Iris stepped forward from the deep shadows cast by the cabins into the pale lamplight spilling from the main house. She was small in stature, but in that moment, her presence was immense. Her hand shook visibly, but her gaze, locked onto Lucien Doe, did not waver. "I signed the document," she said, her voice strengthening with every word. "I am the witness, and I will testify to its truth." Lucien turned toward her, his eyes blazing with renewed, terrifying fury. For a heartbeat, the workers watching from the quarters believed he might strike her, that he might finally unleash the full violence simmering just beneath his skin. But he did not. Instead, a slow, chilling smile crept across his face, the same cold, poisonous smile that had once sent a shiver down Tobias Holt's spine. "Then you will hang with them," he said softly, his voice thick with venom. "All of you will pay for this insolence." What followed is preserved in public record, though As so often happens in moments of upheaval, those records are incomplete, fragmented, and deliberately obscured. Official accounts omit inconvenient truths, smoothing over details that threaten the stability of the established order. On the crisp, cool morning of March 21st, 1874, the air still heavy with damp earth and the faint promise of spring, Lucien Doe rode into Greensburg. He was not alone. Henri and Julien rode at his sides, their faces grim, their expressions tight with anger and unease. Behind them followed 3 armed men, seasoned overseers from the Doe estate, rifles slung across their saddles, their presence an unmistakable warning. The small procession moved with grim purpose down the main street, hooves striking dust and stone, drawing wary glances from the few townspeople already awake. Lucien went straight to the courthouse, its brick facade looming especially severe in the morning light. He strode inside, his boots thundering against the wooden floor, his presence filling the quiet building with an almost tangible menace. He demanded the ledger where property filings were kept, his voice echoing beneath the high ceiling. The clerk, a nervous young man named Thomas Whitley, scarcely out of his teens, spectacles perched precariously on his nose, emerged from a back office. His hands shook as he retrieved the massive leather-bound ledger from its shelf, its thick pages bearing the history of land, debt, and ownership in St. Helena Parish. He placed it on the counter with a soft, heavy thud and opened it to the most recent entries, his eyes darting anxiously between Lucien and the page. There it was, dated March 20th, 1874, written in clear, precise script. The document stated unequivocally that 2 girls, Cora and Clara, formerly held by Lucien Doe, had been legally freed and were no longer subject to any claim of ownership. Their freedom was now recorded in the same official books that had once been used to bind them. The document bore Iris's signature, listed plainly as a witness, clear, firm, undeniable. And most crucially, it carried the counter-signature and official stamp of a justice of the peace named Albert Finch, lending it full legal authority. Lucien's eyes narrowed as he read. His face, already flushed, darkened to a dangerous purple. He slammed his fist onto the counter, making Whitley flinch violently. He demanded to see Finch. The clerk stammered, explaining that Finch had left town that very morning, traveling north toward Baton Rouge on urgent family business, and would not return for several days, an absence that felt either tragically coincidental or painfully convenient. Lucien then demanded that the document be removed immediately, ripped from the ledger, destroyed, erased. Whitley shook his head, his face pale. He explained, barely above a whisper, that he lacked the authority to remove a legally filed document without a court order, without the explicit command of a judge. Once entered, the ledger was sacrosanct. Lucien slammed his fist down again, the sound echoing through the courthouse. He told the terrified clerk that the document would be removed one way or another, with or without cooperation. His eyes burned with a promise of consequences. Then he turned and left, his heavy footsteps reverberating through the building, his sons and armed men falling in behind him. But he did not return to the estate. Instead, his fury still boiling, Lucien went straight to the sheriff's office, a modest building across the dusty square. The sheriff of St. Helena Parish in 1874 was a man named Cyrus Tate. In his late 50s, Tate's face bore the marks of hard life and harder choices. A former Confederate officer, he had returned home after the war to find his world overturned. He resented Reconstruction, resented federal oversight, resented the idea that people he had once considered property now stood before the law as equals. Yet Cyrus Tate was also a pragmatist. He understood power. He understood that while he despised the new laws, they were still laws, and his duty, however reluctant, was to enforce them. Lucien Doe burst into Tate's office, his rage radiating like heat from a furnace. He declared that 2 girls had stolen property from him, that they had forged legal documents, that they were inciting unrest among his workers. He demanded that they be arrested immediately arrested and returned to his custody, their insolence punished. Sheriff Tate, a man of few words, listened without interruption, his expression steady and unreadable. When Lucien finished his furious tirade, Tate calmly asked to see the document. Lucien, still seething, produced a crumpled paper Cora had given him and tossed it onto Tate's desk with a sharp, dismissive flick. Tate picked it up, smoothed the creases with deliberate care, and read it slowly, tracing every line with his eyes. When he looked up, his face revealed nothing. "This states they were freed, Mr. Doe," Tate said evenly, his voice stripped of judgment. "It's a forgery," Lucien roared, slamming his fist onto the desk so hard the inkwell jumped. "A blatant criminal forgery. Do you have proof of that forgery, Mr. Doe?" Tate asked calmly. "A sworn affidavit, a witness to the falsification." "I don't need proof," Lucien thundered, his face contorted with rage. "They are my property. They were purchased legally before God and man." Tate leaned back in his creaking wooden chair, his gaze moving from Lucien to the document and back again. "With all due respect, Mr. Doe, slavery has been illegal for 9 years. The 13th Amendment. If these girls were held against their will, that is a crime. And if this document is filed at the courthouse and signed by a justice of the peace, then as far as the law is concerned, they are free. My hands are tied." Lucien's expression darkened, like a storm cloud gathering. "Whose side are you on, Tate?" he snarled, the question edged with threat. "I'm on the side of the law, Mr. Doe," Tate replied, his voice hardening slightly, a flash of steel in his eyes. "And the law, as it stands, says they are free. I cannot arrest free citizens without cause." Lucien rose abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. "Then the law," he spat, contempt dripping from every word, "is wrong. And you, Sheriff, are a fool." He turned and stormed out of the office, his sons and armed men following, leaving Tate alone in the quiet room, the crumpled document still lying on his desk. And that was the moment things began to unravel, not only for Lucien Doe, but for the fragile order of Greensburg itself. Blinded by rage, Lucien made a catastrophic mistake. He returned to the courthouse, his thoughts consumed by a single destructive aim: to erase the document, to obliterate the evidence of his humiliation. Thomas Whitley, the young clerk, was still behind the counter, his face pale, his hands unsteady. When he saw Lucien and his entourage re-enter, dread settled deep in his chest. Lucien marched straight to the counter, his eyes locked on the ledger, and demanded it again, his voice low and menacing. Summoning what little courage he had, Whitley refused. He clutched the heavy ledger to his chest, his knuckles whitening. Without a word, Lucien seized him by the collar and slammed him violently against the wall, the impact rattling shelves and scattering loose papers. Henri and Julien stood watching, their expressions blank, while the 3 armed men moved to the doors, blocking any exit, any interference. But Whitley was not alone in the courthouse that day. Other clerks were present. A few lawyers were reviewing documents. Several townspeople were filing papers. They all saw it. They saw a powerful man assaulting a public official in broad daylight, his fury unchecked. One of them, a respected local attorney named Marcus Hale, stepped forward. He was a man of medium height, with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp, intelligent eyes. His initial shock hardened into cold, righteous anger. He told Lucien, his voice calm but firm, to release the clerk. Lucien ignored him, his grip tightening. Hale raised his voice, so it carried through the suddenly silent courthouse. "Mr. Doe, you are assaulting a public official. This is a grave offense. If you do not release him immediately, I will have you arrested." Lucien turned slowly, his eyes blazing with a wild, dangerous light as he finally acknowledged Hale's presence. "You will do nothing, lawyer," he snarled. "You will stand aside and mind your own business." "I will do what the law requires, Mr. Doe," Hale replied, his voice unwavering, his gaze meeting Lucien's directly. "And the law requires that I report this assault." Then, in a moment of unrestrained, incandescent rage, a moment he would later regret with bitterness that would consume him, Lucien Doe drew a small, silver-plated pistol from his coat pocket. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoed through the courthouse, sharp and unmistakable. He aimed it directly at Marcus Hale. His hand trembled slightly, but his intent was unmistakable. The room fell utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unbearable tension. "The law," Lucien said, his voice shaking with fury, "is whatever I say it is, and I say you will be silent." Before he could speak another word, before he could make another move, Sheriff Tate entered the courthouse. He had heard the commotion from his office across the square, the shouting, the crash, the sudden, unnatural silence. He came in with his hand already resting on the grip of his revolver. When he saw Lucien Doe standing with a pistol drawn, aimed at a respected citizen, Tate drew his own weapon, the weight familiar and steady in his hand. "Put it down, Doe," Tate said, his voice low, calm, and absolute. There was no negotiation in it. Lucien did not move, his eyes still locked on Hale, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "Put it down," Tate repeated, his tone sharpening. "Or I will shoot." "Where you stand," Tate repeated, his voice colder now, sharper, a clear and final warning. "I will not hesitate." For a long, agonizing moment, no one breathed. The fate of Greensburg, perhaps even that of the entire parish, hung suspended on the edge of a single violent act. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lucien lowered the gun. His shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of him, replaced by the dawning realization of just how far he had gone. Sheriff Tate stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Lucien's face. He took the pistol from Lucien's hand, the cold weight of the metal settling heavily into his palm. Then, with swift certainty, he placed Lucien Doe under arrest. Henri and Julien finally erupted from their stunned silence, shouting protests, stepping forward with faces twisted in outrage. The three armed men shifted instinctively, hands drifting toward their rifles. Tate raised his revolver slightly, his gaze sweeping over them with uncompromising resolve. He told them, in a voice hard as iron, that if any one of them took another step, if any hand reached for a weapon, he would shoot them all. They stopped. Their bravado evaporated in the face of his certainty. Lucien Doe, the Baron, the man who had believed himself untouchable, was taken to the parish jail, a small, damp structure behind the courthouse. He spent the night there, his fury slowly hardening into something darker and more corrosive, impotent rage. The following morning, he was brought before Judge Horace Bellamy, a stern, unyielding man with little patience for the arrogance of the planter class. Lucien was formally charged with assault, attempted theft of public records, and threatening a public official. The judge's expression remained impassive as he set bail at $5,000, an enormous sum for time, deliberately calculated to ensure Lucien remained incarcerated until it was paid. But the real damage had already been done, the damage that could not be undone, because the story spread. By the end of that day, everyone in Greensburg knew. They knew that Lucien Doe, the powerful Baron, had tried to steal a legal document. They knew he had assaulted a clerk. They knew he had drawn a gun on a respected lawyer. And they knew he had been arrested by Sheriff Tate. And everyone knew why. Because two girls, two former slaves, two children had outmaneuvered him. They had used his own system, his own laws, against him. And in doing so, they shattered the illusion of his invincibility. The whispers in the quarters, the silent defiance, had finally found a voice, and it had toppled the Titan. Lucien Doe was released from jail 3 days later after his lawyers, working frantically, managed to post the exorbitant bail. The payment drained a significant portion of his liquid assets, a bitter and very public cost of his humiliation. But by then, the damage had spread far beyond the dusty boundaries of Greensburg. Newspapers in Baton Rouge and New Orleans seized on the story, hungry for scandal. They embellished details, sharpened language, and painted Lucien as a grotesque symbol of the Old South's dying arrogance. Within a week, the tale of the Baron and the defiant twins was being discussed in parlors, taverns, and saloons across Louisiana, a scandal that fascinated and divided in equal measure. The reactions revealed the deep fractures still running through post-Reconstruction society. Some, largely those who had fiercely supported the Confederacy, who resented federal authority and clung desperately to the old social order, cast Lucien as a victim. They argued that the twins had no right to file legal documents, that the entire affair was a farce orchestrated by carpetbaggers and radical Republicans, and that Lucien had merely tried to reclaim what they still considered his rightful property. To them, his actions were a last stand in defense of tradition, a doomed resistance against an unwelcome modern world. Others saw something very different. Even among those who felt little affection for Reconstruction, many understood that the law, however flawed, now ruled. To them, Lucien Doe was a criminal. He had held 2 girls as slaves 9 years after slavery had been abolished. He had assaulted a public official. He had threatened violence inside a courthouse, a space meant to embody justice itself. And he had been caught, his arrogance laid bare for all to see. His actions were not a defense of tradition, but a blatant act of lawlessness, a direct threat to the fragile new order struggling to take hold. The legal case against Lucien Doe dragged on for months, a bitter and exhausting battle fought through the suffocating heat of the Louisiana summer. His formidable team of attorneys argued relentlessly that the document filed by the twins was invalid, that it had been obtained through fraud and coercion, and that the girls should be returned to his custody, their freedom revoked. They painted Cora and Clara as cunning manipulators, pawns of outside agitators bent on destabilizing the South. But the twins possessed something Lucien Doe did not. They had the truth, and they had the courage to speak it. They testified in court, their voices still soft, but clear and unwavering, their composure remarkable for children their age. They recounted, with chilling precision, how they had been taken from their home in Virginia, sold through the shadowy markets of New Orleans, and held as slaves by Lucien Doe, reduced commodities. They described the conditions of the confinement. The small, cold room, the meager food, the constant surveillance. They spoke of the quiet cruelties, the systematic stripping away of their humanity, the way they had been treated not as people, but as property. Their testimony, delivered with quiet dignity, cut through the dense legal jargon and the bluster of the defense, reaching something far deeper than procedure. It reached conscience. Many in the courtroom felt it. Iris testified as well, her presence itself a powerful symbol of communal courage. She confirmed that she had witnessed the signing of the document, that she had heard the twins' story in full, and that she believed them without reservation. Her calm resolve, her willingness to risk her own life and her children's lives, lent enormous credibility to the case. Marcus Hale, the lawyer who had confronted Lucien in the courthouse, formally took on the twins' case pro bono. He was driven by a deep and personal sense of justice. He argued with controlled intensity that the document was legal and binding, that the twins had every right to file it, and that Lucien Doe had committed multiple serious crimes in his violent attempt to reclaim them. He framed the case not as a dispute over property, but as a defining test of human rights and the rule of law in a South struggling to redefine itself. In August of 1874, after weeks of testimony and intense deliberation, Judge Horace Bellamy delivered his verdict. His voice, usually dry and procedural, carried an uncommon weight of solemnity. He ruled that the document was valid, that Cora and Clara were, beyond any doubt, free citizens of the United States, and that Lucien Doe was guilty of assault, attempted theft of public records, and threatening a public official. Lucien was fined $2,000, a substantial amount, though still only a fraction of his wealth, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. The sentence was meant as a public warning, a declaration that even the most powerful men were not above the law. Lucien Doe never served that sentence. On the night of August 15, 1874, beneath a moonless sky, Lucien Doe vanished. He abandoned his sprawling estate, left his sons behind, and disappeared without a trace. He was never seen again. The circumstances of his disappearance were never fully explained, and speculation quickly took root. Some claimed he fled south into Mexico, escaping both the law and his shattered reputation. Others whispered that he sailed for Europe, seeking refuge in a place where his fabricated nobility might still command respect. A darker rumor suggested he took his own life, unable to endure the disgrace. No definitive answer ever surfaced. His disappearance became a local legend, a cautionary tale passed quietly from one generation to the next. Henri and Julian Doe attempted, clumsily and without conviction, to maintain the estate and preserve what remained of their father's empire. But without Lucien's ruthless discipline and calculated control, everything unraveled. Workers, emboldened by the twins' victory, began to leave, seeking better work, safer lives, or simply distance from the Doe name. Debts that Lucien had carefully managed began to accumulate, overwhelming his sons. Within 2 years, the once grand Doe property was sold at auction, its fields overgrown, its house decaying, its legacy dissolved into obscurity. Henri, broken and directionless, drifted west of the rough frontier towns of Texas and died in a drunken bar fight in 1879. A small, ignoble end to a life built on inherited power. Julian, consumed entirely by his addictions, drank himself to death in a filthy New Orleans boarding house in 1881. His body was discovered by a sympathetic landlady. The Doe name, once spoken with fear in St. Helena Parish, faded into little more than a footnote in the region's troubled past. As for the twins, Cora and Clara, they left St. Helena Parish quietly in the fall of 1874. There were no ceremonies, no farewells, no public acknowledgement. Just a simple departure that contrasted sharply with the drama of their arrival. Iris, the widowed woman who had risked everything for them, went with them along with her 3 children. Together they traveled north on a long, exhausting journey, eventually settling in a small town outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, shaped by Quaker ideals and far removed from the suffocating heat and cruelty of the Delta. There, Cora and Clara opened a small school for freed children. It became a place of learning and quiet hope in a community hungry for education. They taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, their lessons infused with purpose. They never charged a fee. Knowledge, they believed, should never be withheld. They lived modestly, devoting their lives to giving others the very tools that had secured their own freedom. They never spoke publicly about what had happened in Louisiana. The memories were too painful, the wounds too deep, but they kept the document. The original page, once blank, now signed and witnessed, was carefully framed and hung on the wall of their small schoolhouse, a silent declaration of independence. Beneath it, written in Cora's precise, elegant hand, was a single sentence: "Some gifts are not meant to be kept." Iris lived with them until her death in 1891. She became a beloved matriarch, her quiet strength shaping generations. Her children grew, married, and raised families of their own, their lives flourishing in the freedom their mother had helped defend. And they all knew the story, passed down carefully, of 2 girls who had outwitted a baron, who had used words instead of weapons, and of the woman who stood beside them when it mattered most. Cora and Clara lived long, full lives, their bond unbroken. They died within a week of each other during the harsh winter of 1929, their bodies finally yielding to time. They were buried side by side in a small, unremarkable cemetery in Pennsylvania. Their graves were left unmarked, their names known to only a few, but their story remains. It reminds us that history is not always written by those in power. Sometimes it is written by the silent, the overlooked, the brave. What do you think of this story? Does it resonate with the hidden histories you believe are still buried in the records of places like St. Helena Parish? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories that challenge what we think we know and force us to confront uncomfortable truths, then subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves exploring the deepest shadows of the past. See you in the next one.